Starwalker Studios presents the Obsidian Monolith, creating an original campaign for Numenera.
Greetings, Numenerians, and welcome to the second episode of the Obsidian Monolith. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. Today, I start laying the foundation for the campaign. So grab a pen, grab some paper, and get your creative juices going. It's time to create an adventure. Welcome, listener, to episode 2 of the Obsidian Monolith. I'm so glad to be recording this podcast for you today. So if you'll remember last episode, I talked a bit about some questions that I asked myself in the very beginning stages of creating a campaign. Questions to kind of get my creative juices going, to just brainstorm ideas that I can then go to later and start to pick and choose the things that I want to bring into this new campaign that I'm creating. So I kind of set up the foundation last week. So this week, last episode, this episode, I am going to start to actually lay that foundation and start to answer those questions for this particular campaign. So you can already probably guess a few things about the campaign just from the title of the podcast, but normally I would not have a title for the campaign until much later in the process. But again, I have done a lot of this already. I'm a little bit ahead of the podcast as far as in my process, just because I am actually running a group through this campaign right now. We just started. As of the time of recording, we've played 2 sessions so far. So I'm a little bit working ahead so that I can run them through it, so that hopefully they will be able to listen to the podcast if they want to, and I won't be spoiling things that they haven't encountered yet. But a little bit of that is probably unavoidable, but I'm going to try to avoid as much of it as I can. So the first question that I listed last episode that I like to ask myself is, who are my players? So first, I'm wondering about who's going to be playing this adventure, because as much as I can, I want to make the adventure to fit the players so that they enjoy it. So who are my players? What kind of adventures do they like? So for this particular case, for me, this is kind of unknown, because not only am I making the adventure for my group I'm currently running now, but I would like to be able to run this adventure for other groups in the future. And I would like for you to be able to run this adventure for your group if you want. And of course, I can't know who you're playing with. I can't really answer this question, but I want to appeal to as many players as possible. So I want to appeal to as many types of adventures as I can. So the next question was, what kind of characters do they like to play? And again, I don't know, but I want to try to create an adventure that will be fun for as many different types of characters as I can. Next questions were, are there anything off limits because of age or other sensitivities? So again, for me personally, I want something that will appeal to as wide of an audience as possible. So I'm going to be basically shooting for PG-13 campaign, because again, I don't know who's going to be playing this, and I want to appeal to as many people as possible. So for the most part, I think I'll probably be avoiding more mature things, but I am not designing this campaign for children. And if it turns out that those things happen, then they happen. I mean, this is very early in the process, so it's a little early to say even, maybe this will end up being a mature campaign. We'll have to see. What kind of story do I want to tell? This is something I will get into later. What types of gameplay do I want to feature? Do I want lots of combat? Do I want lots of social interactions? Do I want intrigue, politics, mystery? And my answer to these questions is yes. I want all of these things. Again, I want as many types of gameplay in this as I can. Now, I don't think that it will be very easy or even possible to have all these things in every adventure. And right now, what I'm kind of thinking is each adventure will kind of highlight one of these aspects a little bit more than the other. So for instance, I've created the entire first adventure at this point, and I can tell you that the first adventure is fairly straightforward. There's a lot of combat, there's a lot of exploration. It's almost kind of like a dungeon crawl in a way, in that the PCs will be exploring a facility, but in a lot of ways it's not like a dungeon crawl, and we'll get to that again later. So this first adventure is pretty straightforward because I will probably have people who have never played Numenera before playing this adventure, and maybe even people who've never played any kind of tabletop role-playing game before playing this adventure. So I want to start out with something that's pretty easy to grok, but yet still has some weirdness to it and still showcases Numenera and gets across that, this isn't just a hack and slash kind of game, even though my first adventure does have a lot of action in it. Are the PCs going to be working for someone, or are they going to be completely independent? And this also kind of dovetails into the how plotted is this going to be versus how sandbox is it going to be. And I think what I want to do for my campaign is I do want to start out with the PCs working for someone, in quotes, that may or may not be literal. But I do want to start out, at least in the beginning, having some kind of mentor figure for the PCs that can give them direction as far as giving them basically missions to complete. So if we are dealing with some new players, whether new to the game or new to the hobby, that we can give them some structure if they need it. But I'm also going to try to write the campaign in such a way that it's not required that they do this. And if the PCs decide to go completely off the rails and not do what the mentor person wants them to do, or do it for their own reasons, that I'll be able to accommodate that, because I don't like linear games of any kind, and I don't like role-playing experiences where I feel like I have to do a certain thing because that's what the adventure says. So as much as I can, I'm going to kind of leave it open-ended as much as possible. But I do think it's important in the beginning to have a little bit of structure there for the players if they want it, or if they like that kind of play. And then they can choose to remain with that structure for a long period of time or not, as they wish. So again, this brings us to the whole sandbox versus plot driven. And again, my answer is yes. We've been discussing this quite a bit on the various communities. And even though at this point, at the point of recording, most of you have not heard the first episode of the Obsidian Monolith yet, I have talked about the whole sandbox versus plot-driven spectrum on GM Intrusions. I believe it was with Brian Kershaw that we talked about that a little bit. And I've asked about it on the Google community page and some other places. And it does seem that kind of the consensus is that going too far to either end of that spectrum results in a game that tends to be unfun. And the sweet spot for most groups is somewhere in the middle. So I am going to try throughout the course of the campaign to try to have aspects that are more open-ended and aspects that are more plot-driven. Although, again, every single adventure may not have both. Certain adventures may veer more towards plot-driven and other adventures may veer more towards sandbox. We'll see. But, I do have slightly different considerations than you may, because I am hoping to run this with multiple groups. But even if you're running it for one group that you know very well, I think you're still going to want to have these types of variety in gameplay and how much plot there is and things like that to keep the campaign from getting stale. Because if every adventure is a mystery and every adventure has lots of social interactions and not much combat, it's going to start to get old. Just the same thing if every adventure is heavily plotted or every adventure is very sandboxy, it's going to get old. So it's good to change things up as much as you can. So at this point, I've answered some of these very basic questions about my players and about the campaign. So now that I've kind of got this very basic framework in my mind of what I hope to achieve with the campaign. Now I start trying to come up with some specific ideas of things that I think will be cool to include in the campaign. So this can be ideas of settings, different interesting places I want to go, characters, interesting NPCs that I want to use or introduce, interesting creatures I want to use or introduce, and as well as plot. Like what kind of story do I want to tell? What do I want the arc of the campaign to be? Those kinds of things. And so personally, what I did for this is, first of all along, since I first got the Numenera core book, the first Numenera book I got, I had a notebook where, as I was reading the book, anytime I read something that I thought was really cool or I thought would be fun to use in an adventure, I would write it down in my notebook, write down the page number. And I did this with the bestiary, which actually I haven't completely read the bestiary from cover to cover. I'll admit I'm still exploring that, which I'm not in a hurry to read it from cover to cover. I mean, I'm sure Monty Cook Games is cranking out books as fast as they can, but from a consumer point of view, you know, I have to wait a few months between every book. So I like to get as much mileage out of, you know, the experience of getting to read something for the first time as I can. And, you know, I only need so many creatures for any given gaming session anyway. So I'm still slowly making my way through the bestiary, and there's still quite a few things in there I haven't read yet. But as I read any Numenera supplement, I am constantly adding to this list of just cool ideas. And I have a few different lists. I have a list of names. So anytime I come up with a name or anytime I see a name somewhere, whether it's someone I meet in real life that has a cool name I've never heard before, or maybe a book I'm reading, there's a cool name I haven't seen before, just a name I like, I'll add it to that list. And also just reading through the Numenera core book and other supplements, if I see a name I like, I add it to the list. And I have a list of, I like to be really organized. So instead of having one huge list, I have a bunch of more categorized lists. So I have my list of names. I have a list of like a setting list or a places list. So when I'm reading geography sections of the book and I see a cool place, I'll add that to that list. I have a list of plot devices, like plot elements that I come up with or see that I like. I have a list of discoveries, so weird Numenera items or complexes that aren't things you can take with you. I have a list of Numenera items that could end up being ciphers or artifacts or even oddities that I come up with. So I have all kinds of lists of different things. And then I just have a generic list of just ideas that I come up with. And then some ideas just stay in the ideas list. And then some later get moved into one of the more categorized lists, depending on what the idea is. So at this point in making the campaign, I've already made these lists, but I also, as I started sitting down to actually start generating ideas for this particular campaign, I went through some areas of the Numenera core book again, and I gave the specific places in the core book that I find inspiration in the first episode of the Obsidian Monolith, but some of the big ones are the geography chapters. So there's a chapter about the Steadfast, there's a chapter about the Beyond, there's one about Beyond the Beyond, and then also the Organizations chapter. Those are some great places to get all kinds of ideas, and of course in the bestiary as well. So I have all these pages of all these ideas, and what I do is I just start going through the ideas and I make a little mark beside the ones that are really interesting to me, kind of the cream of the crop, the first cut, okay? And then once I've done that through all my lists, then I go through all the ones that I kind of picked out as my favorite ideas, and I just go through them kind of again and again and again and wait for connections to start to form. And it's amazing how organically this happens. You don't even really have to force it. You'll just notice that certain ideas will just naturally connect together. It's like, oh, well, I could take this thing and that thing and that thing and put it together, and hey, I've got something cool. But another thing to do with Numenera specifically, once you've done that, is to go through it again and do kind of try to force it, or try to find connections that aren't obvious, that are connecting things that it seems really bizarre to try to connect together. Because again, as we're creating all this, we always want to keep in mind the weird and be injecting as much weird into our story as we can. So this is what I did. I went through this process as I just described it to you. So I thought what I would do at this point is I will tell you some of my ideas, some of the ideas that at this point in the creation process were the ones I really liked, the ones that I thought would maybe work well for this campaign, and the ones that I used to start to figure out exactly what this campaign is going to be about. Now, again, you're going through this process with me, so it's very likely that by the end of this process, some of these ideas will have been thrown out at some point. I'm not getting married to any of these ideas. Even the title of my campaign, the Obsidian Monolith, I'm not married to that. Now, it will be a bit of a pain in the ass if I later change the name of the campaign, but what needs to happen, what needs to happen. And this is kind of a weird thing where you're kind of like, if this were a video game, you're in the pre-alpha with me, which normally, I would not show this to people because it's not ready yet for people to see it. But I'm wanting you to learn from my process. So it's very possible that even the title could change, or even what this thing is all about could change. But this is what, at this point in the process, I'm thinking, okay, these are some cool ideas that I may want to use. And these are some thoughts that I'm thinking about as I start to build this thing. So initial concepts. So the first thing, and you can kind of see, I think, by this list how I'm actually going through the core book. And when you open the core book, once you get past like the copyright information and title page and table of contents and all that stuff, pretty much the first thing you come to is the short story, The Amber Monolith. And The Amber Monolith was actually my first introduction to Numenera. I found out about Numenera not very long, like literally days after the Kickstarter had ended. I don't even remember how I found it out. I saw someone talk about it on a forum or something. And so I went to the Numenera.com website and I'm like, what is this? I want to learn more about it. And the first thing I found was the story, The Amber Monolith. And I read The Amber Monolith. And that was literally the first thing I read about Numenera, about the Ninth World. That's what introduced me to the game. And I don't think it's an accident at all that it's the first thing in the book. It's a great introduction to the game and the setting. So I really enjoyed the story. I found it really evocative. The idea of this man out in the wilderness, in the desert, all by himself, and going to explore this huge thing floating up way in the air that no one else, at least as far as is known, that no one else had ever gotten into before because it's so high up in the air and no one knew how to get into it. And all by himself with just his dog as a companion, he goes up into this thing, figures out how to get in. It's very clever and uses a lot of ingenuity with the tech that he has with him and the tech he finds along the way, and explores this thing and has some adventures and meets some dangerous mechanical creatures inside, and was just, to me, it was a very inspiring story. And it's really what hooked me into the setting and made me want to play this game when it came out. Once I got the core book and I started learning more about the setting, I also found it really interesting how the story of the Amber Monolith and Father Calaval, his discovery of it, how this basically led to the Order of the Truth being what it is today. Now, it does seem, from what I've read in the core book, that the Order of Truth existed before this. He didn't start the Order, but it kind of seems like it wasn't what it is today. It wasn't as big of a group. It wasn't as influential. And so he kind of brought the Order to a new level because of what he discovered in the Amber Monolith and the information and knowledge and understanding that they were able to get from studying the things within the Amber Monolith. So I think it's really interesting that much of what the Order is today and much of what it has, as far as the understanding of Numenera that it has, and the ability of the Eon priests to create Numenera items and to figure out Numenera items and to stick Numenera items together to make new things. I think it's really interesting how so much of that can be traced to Father Calaval and his discovery of the Amber Monolith and the discoveries and understanding that came from that, how that was kind of like the stone in the still water, and it just sent these ripples out that are still having effects today, 400 years later. So one of the first ideas I had about this campaign is, it's been 400 years since Father Calaval explored the Amber Monolith, and we see the result of 400 years of research into what he found. And it seems to me to make sense and be very great for a story to say that at this point, the Order of Truth has basically learned everything they can learn from the Amber Monolith and from what Father Calaval discovered 400 years ago. They've definitely gotten to the point of diminishing returns, where it's taking a lot more work and a lot more study to glean just a tiny bit of new data from these discoveries. So it occurred to me, well, look at all that the Amber Monolith has done for the Order of Truth in the last 4 centuries, and look at the quantum leap in just the quality of life for people in the Steadfast it has brought about from the greater understanding of the Numenera and how to use them. How much more could the Order learn? How much more power and influence could they gain if they had another discovery on that level of equal importance to the Amber Monolith? It could lead to another 4 centuries of growth and development and another quantum leap of the level of technology and just quality of life of people in the Steadfast. So I thought that was a cool idea. Like maybe the Order of Truth is going after something that they think will be as influential or even more influential on the future as the Amber Monolith was. And how cool would that be? And how fun would it be for the PCs to be part of that, to be as much a part of the next 400 years of history as Father Calaval was of the last 400 years of history. So I got really excited about that idea, and I was so excited about that idea that it very quickly kind of became the heart of this campaign that was growing in my mind. And as soon as I had that idea, which was actually one of the first, if not the first ideas I had for the campaign, it was so influential that it started kind of selecting future ideas, because I started looking for ideas of things that would fit with that really well. So another thing I found in my exploration of the core book, as I started to explore this idea more and what I could do with it, is, of course, I started looking at the Amber Monolith and what we're told about the Amber Monolith in the core book. And I guess another thing I didn't mention is another thing that I really like about the story of the Amber Monolith and the Amber Monolith itself as a Numenera relic is I just think visually it's just ridiculously cool. This humongous structure floating up 1,000 feet in the air, made of some unknown material that looks kind of like amber, and it looks like it's just this huge chunk of carved stone, but it's actually a structure with innards. And I believe, if I remember correctly, when you're close enough to the Amber Monolith, you can actually see some workings within it because it's partly transparent and you can see machinery inside, and it has these discs that are spinning around it. And the whole thing just, it defies gravity and it defies understanding. Why is this thing here? You know, who built it and why? Is it just some kind of monument, or does it have a purpose? We don't know. And I also thought the whole thing of how Father Calaval finds this chamber inside that has this like basically teleportation thing inside of it that sends him to some satellite or space station in orbit. And then, you know, they learn all this stuff from the tech there, was also really cool. So I also, as I was doing my research in the core book, I started looking at the obelisk of the water god, which, in case you don't know, the Amber Monolith, if you look at your Numenera core book, the Amber Monolith is the image on the front of the core book. That is the Amber Monolith. And then if you look within the core book on, I think, every page in the margin, there's a little image of another monolith that looks very similar to the Amber Monolith, except it's a different color. And it's actually the image, the album art that I use for GM Intrusions, the podcast. That is the obelisk of the water god. And it is said in the core book that the order, I think it's the order, or maybe just people in general, it's believed that somehow the obelisk of the water god and the Amber Monolith are somehow related or connected. But nobody really knows how. Nobody really knows if that's even true. But there's this belief that they're somehow connected. So I thought that was cool. And I thought, well, what if there are other monoliths? And what if the obelisk of the water god and the Amber Monolith are connected in some way? And what if these other monoliths are connected as well to each other and to the Amber Monolith and the obelisk of the water god? What if they're all connected? That would be cool. And that would be something fun to explore. So if you look at the Navarine map, and I don't think, let me look at my map behind me real quick. Yeah, I was right. You can't see these on the full world map, but if you go into the geography, into the Steadfast chapter, and you find the section on Navarine, there is a map of the area of Navarine itself. And when you look on that map, you find that there are 4 more possible monoliths on that map. There are 3 in Navarine and 1 nearby in the Cloud Crystal Skyfields. Now, these are the browned out or grayed out icons, which if you look on the legend of the map, this particular icon means floating relic. So it's the same icon that they used for the Amber Monolith and the obelisk of the water god. So just in the area around Navarine, 3 in Navarine, 1 nearby in the Cloud Crystal Skyfields, there are 4 more of these floating relics. And they're browned out, grayed out, so I don't have to worry about Monty Cook Games ever in the future saying, oh, this is what this particular one is. They're always going to be left to individual GMs to figure out. So I thought, well, how cool would it be if those are monoliths very similar to the Amber Monolith and the obelisk of the water god? And maybe they are connected in some way, or maybe at the very least, the Order of Truth believes or thinks they're connected in some way. So another kind of idea that was spinning around in my head with all this other stuff is the Order of Truth itself. I really, really like the Order of Truth. And I also think that the Order of Truth is something that a lot of people seem to, quote unquote, get wrong about the setting. Now, again, you know, the caveat of caveats, you know, your setting is your setting, your game is your game, and you can do whatever the hell you want. But as far as the canon setting of the Ninth World, it seems like I see a lot of people kind of misunderstanding what the Order of Truth is. So if you go into the organizations chapter, which is the last chapter in the kind of setting part of the book, which if you're looking at the color coding on the sides of the pages is the brown section, I believe. If you look at the organizations chapter, there's a big section on the Order of Truth, and it tells you all about the Order of Truth. And the thing that I see a lot of people kind of get wrong about it is some people seem to think that it actually is a religion because it is presented as a religion. I mean, the Eon priests are called priests after all, and they use religious titles for their ranks and things like that. And they act very much like religious figures when they're out in public. So some people kind of take this to mean that it actually is a religion and they quote unquote worship the past or they worship science. And it's not a religion at all. The Eon priests don't worship anything. They are, for lack of a better term, they are scientists, or at least they're doing the best to be scientists in the world and, you know, the time that they're in. The whole religious thing is the perception of people from outside of the Order of Truth who don't really understand what the Order of Truth is. And as it's described in the book, for the longest time, the order, they were doing their thing, which is basically to try to uncover and unlock as much as they can from the past and understand as much of the Numenera as they can and learn to use these ancient technologies to improve the quality of life for everybody in the ninth world. And so they're doing these things, and keep in mind that a lot of people in the ninth world, they view all this stuff as magic because they don't understand it, and they don't understand the scientific method, and they don't understand advanced technologies. So to them, it's all magic. They're superstitious. They believe in gods or spirits or things like that. And so these people are not really understanding what the Order of Truth is doing. And every time they talk to the Order of Truth, the Aeon priests are using these terms that they don't understand. They're using their own version of scientific jargon. They're trying to explain to these people, these ancient technologies and what they're about. And the people just don't understand it. Another area where you encounter people talking about things you don't understand and using words you don't understand and seeming to try to prevent you from understanding is religion. And they had no frame of reference for science. I mean, science is like that too. I mean, if you don't know a whole lot about biology and you start talking to a molecular biologist and really ask them deep questions about molecular biology, you're not going to understand 1 in 10 words that they say. Because, I've taken molecular biology and there aren't common terms for any of it. It's all scientific, genus, species kind of terminology for everything, because this is stuff that you can't see with the naked eye. So there is no lay person speak for this stuff, because lay people have no concept of any of this. They've never seen it, and they never will unless they watch, a Discovery show about it or something. So, so science can be like that, where you're talking to this person and they might as well be speaking another language. And religion can seem that way to the uninitiated as well. So the people of the ninth world were like, well, obviously they're part of some weird religion that worships the past, and that's why we're not really understanding. And I'm sure at the beginning, the Aeon priests were trying to, no, it's not a religion at all, and trying to explain it to them, and the people were just consistently not understanding or misunderstanding. And so finally, the Aeon priests just got sick of beating their heads against the wall, and they're like, whatever. Yeah, it's a religion, whatever. Believe what you want to believe. And then they found out that, well, there's actually some benefit to this, because people will give authority to religious figures. And as a religious figure, you can tell someone, well, this is what you should do. And you can even give them some explanation that makes no rational sense at all. Or you can just not bother to give them an explanation and they'll do it. And so the order quickly realized that being seen as religious figures and religious authorities gave them a lot of influence over people and gave them political power. And so from that point on, they started not only just enduring this misconception of what they were, but they started to actually support and even reinforce the idea, even going so far as to calling themselves Aeon priests and calling their different ranks based on religious titles. And when they were doing things in public, adding an air of ritual and superstition to it, to just further reinforce this idea that they're a religion and they're religious figures, because it allowed them to do the things they wanted to do, have the access to things they needed to have influence over people as individuals, and have influence over people on a national level, and actually be able to bring the nations of the steadfast together and be an authority over all of them. None of this could have happened if they weren't seen as a religion. So this worked very well. And then also, they didn't have to answer these annoying questions anymore, because the people were more willing to accept things they didn't understand if it was couched in mysticism and religion than they were when the priests were trying to give them these very technical explanations to their questions. I really like the Order of Truth. I really like this almost kind of turning things as they stand in our society today on its head, and reversing everything, and having this group that they're really scientists, but they're couching it in superstition and mysticism. just so that they can have access to what they want to have access to and have authority and be able to do their thing without being harassed by people. And I like this idea of, these people who are very kind of backwards and superstitious, like seeing it all as a religion and not really understanding what's really going on at all. I mean, there's so many layers of nuance there and so much you can play with there. And I wanted to play with that. And I also like the Order as a possible organization for the PCs to be part of, because there are a lot of interesting contradictions within the Order of Truth. Because on the one hand, you can say, well, the Order of Truth is very noble. I mean, they're seeking scientific truth. They're seeking to better the lives of everybody in the world. They're seeking to join these 9 kingdoms together and keep them from fighting amongst themselves. And this all seems very noble and altruistic and very much something that we can admire. But yet at the same time, look at some of the ways they use that power. For instance, the Crusades with the Gaians, which, it says in the core book that basically one of the main reasons, if not the main reason or even the only reason, that the Amber Pope has declared war on the Gaians is just to give the kingdoms of the Steadfast a common enemy so they can focus their militaries and their energies on fighting the Gaians and hopefully not on fighting each other. Kind of the whole, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. And it's like, well, from just a, getting your objectives done at the end of the day point of view, well, that's really genius and smart. But from a more moral or ethical point of view, it's very questionable, to say the least. And so obviously the Order is not as noble as we think, or not as noble as they would like us to think. Perhaps there are different factions in the Order. Perhaps there are some factions that are all about scientific truth and they don't care about political power. And maybe there are other factions that are more all about the political power and the lifestyle it can give them and the ability to control people and control nations and control the world. And I think these are all really interesting things and things that will be really fun to explore. And one thing I like to do in my campaigns with my players is I like to set up kind of dilemmas like this where the players have to make a choice. They have to take a stand. So what if the players are put in a position where they have to decide for themselves where they stand? What do they think about the Crusades against the Gaians? Is this something that the Order should be doing in order to solidify its power over the Steadfast for the greater good of the Steadfast? Or is this something that is not good and is something that is undermining the integrity of the Order and what they're trying to do and could perhaps ultimately blow up in their face? What do the PCs think about this? Where do they stand? Are they going to take a stand, or are they going to try to sit on the fence? And I think these are really interesting questions to explore. So again, it's a little early to be thinking about themes for the campaign, but I'm definitely not going to ignore any that just seem to kind of come up all by themselves. So some possible themes for this campaign, as far as dealing with the Order of Truth, could be, how does the Order balance the search for scientific understanding with their position of political and even religious power, if there's a difference, and influence? How has their political position influenced their research, and how will it influence the future of their research? Are they a little more focused on weapons and things like that? What is the future of the Order if it continues on its current trajectory? Is this future desirable? If not, can it be avoided? If so, how? So these are questions I'm very interested in, and they're questions that I hope maybe to bring up in the game. And I would be very happy to hear some debates among my players at the table about these very topics. Now, one thing I do want to say at this point is that I am a little loath to dig too deeply into the inner workings of the Order of Truth, mostly because I think it's a very real possibility that more about the Order of Truth will be revealed in the World Guide, which is coming out before too long. So I would really like to wait until the World Guide comes out before I start saying, oh, well, these are all the different ranks in the Order, and this is what they're called, and this is how you get from this rank to that rank, because I don't know if or what they're going to tell us in the world guide, and I want to try to avoid things that could be contradicted by Monte Cook Games. So one idea I had of a possible way to kind of sidestep this problem, at least for now, is I could either have the story take place in the Beyond or in some other place that isn't in direct contact with the Order of Truth itself, like its centralized body. So in the Beyond, each Aldea tends to have an Eon priest that kind of helps them out, but that priest tends to be not in contact with the rest of the Order and the Steadfast. So I could have the story take place someplace like that, and then I don't have to worry about the kind of inner workings of the Order, at least not in the beginning. So that's an idea that I'll keep in mind. So at this point, I kind of have an initial seed for the campaign kind of germinating in my head, kind of connecting these different ideas together. And so my thinking at this point is, well, maybe the Order sends a group of operatives to gain entry and explore one of these other monoliths. You know, they've achieved what they can achieve from exploring the Amber Monolith and the space station that it connects to, and they're looking for the next great leap in their understanding. And they know that there are these other monoliths floating around, and it stands to reason if they got 400 years of tech and development and research from the Amber Monolith, that they may be able to do the same with one of the others. So yeah, maybe the PCs get to explore one of the Amber Monolith's brothers or sister. And I had also the idea of maybe throughout the campaign, the PCs could explore multiple monoliths. Because like I said, I could have up to 4 additional monoliths like the Amber Monolith in the area without adding anything to the map that isn't already there. Not to mention, I can always add more floating relics to the map if I want. Oh, I skipped a step, which is the Obsidian Monolith. I came up with the Obsidian Monolith just because I liked the Amber Monolith. Like, obviously, it's probably not made of amber, but people looked at it and they said, oh, it kind of looks like amber, so we're going to call it the Amber Monolith. And I like the idea, well, you know, of all, because the Obelisk of the Water God looks similar and yet different from the Amber Monolith. So I like that idea of having all of these relics like have the same basic shape, but yet be very different as well. And so I thought, well, maybe the other ones look like other types of semi-precious or precious stones. And I was thinking of all the different colors and all the different stones. And I hit on obsidian, and I just really liked it because, first of all, I thought Obsidian Monolith just sounded cool. Just the way it sounds cool. I liked obsidian because it's black and it's at the same time transparent, like you can see through it, but yet it's so dark that you can't see very deep into it. So if you have a really thin piece of obsidian, you can see through it. But if you have a very big piece at all, it looks pretty much opaque. And so I kind of like the symbolism there, and I like the symbolism of it being black. It kind of calls the mind kind of a darker story, which I really like. I was talking about on, I think, Twitter or Google Plus the other day after I'd finished the second session of my first adventure, how I think that exploring ancient complexes left over from these hyper advanced civilizations from millions of years ago, that should be an extremely dangerous and scary thing to do in my mind. I think every time you step into one of those places, you should really be thinking, I'm probably never coming out. This is probably going to be the end of me. If I actually get out alive, that will be a miracle. If I get out alive and sane and with all my appendages, that's probably too much to even hope for. So I think that these people that go and explore these places are a combination of extremely brave and at least slightly crazy. And I like the Lovecraftian, the In Strange Eons glimmer. I like the idea of bringing some horror into the game and not like suspense and horror, not like just hack and slash and blood and guts everywhere, but the actual kind of psychological horror like H.P. Lovecraft was famous for. I think that works really well with Numenera. And like I said, I think exploring these places should be extremely dangerous. I think it should be extremely scary, and you're encountering things that are stretching way beyond your limits of comprehension and even the limits of what your psyche can handle. And so having this Obsidian Monolith really plays into that thematically and visually very well. So anyway, so getting back to my idea of having multiple monoliths, I thought that, maybe they could be different colors or look like different stones or whatever. And if I went that route, then the Obsidian Monolith might not be the title of the campaign, but might be just the title of the first series of adventures, like the first chapter of the campaign or whatever. If I was going to go that route, I could have had the Obsidian Monolith be the last one that they explore, kind of like the climax of the entire campaign is exploring this thing. And I do like that idea, because if I came up with a bunch of different monoliths, I think the Obsidian one would be my favorite, just because of the reasons I mentioned. And I like the idea of saving the best for last. But again, I'm not married to this idea of even having multiple monoliths, because, maybe having more than one, it kind of cheapens it, right? Like one thing is unique, but once there's more than one, it's no longer as unique. Once the PCs are exploring their third of these things, it might be old hat by then. So at this point, I'm kind of leaning on just having one monolith and having, other discoveries and complexes and things that the PCs can explore on the way to getting to the monolith, but having the monolith be like the big uber thing that they explore at the end, the Obsidian Monolith. So again, we'll just see where the story goes. A lot of writers talk about some writers are more like outline writers, and some writers are more discovery writers. So some writers they come up with the whole story in an outline form beforehand, and then they start writing it, and maybe they make some changes here and there, but mainly they stick with this thing they plotted out beforehand. And then other writers, they just start writing and they come up with characters and they put them in a situation, and they just kind of like playing a role-playing game, but playing multiple characters and GMing at the same time. They kind of just, what would the character do? What would this character do? And they just see where the story takes them. And it's just an exploration. It's a discovery. So that's kind of more what I'm doing with this adventure. Is I am not coming up with a whole bunch ahead of time for the entire adventure or even the entire campaign, partly because, it would just be that much longer before I could do this podcast if I did it that way, because I'd have to come up with everything first. And partly because that kind of thing doesn't work real well with a role-playing game. And that's one reason why published adventures can be problematic a lot of times, is because they can't adapt to what the players do and choices that the players make. And so I want to be as agile with this as I can, at least with my first group, and be able to react to what they're doing, and then just hope that they're kind of a good sample for how a lot of players will do it. Of course, every group will do things differently. So again, that comes back to the leaving it as open-ended as I can and having as few plot points as I can, so that, no matter what your group does or how your group goes through this, it will still work for you. So one last idea I'll talk about before I wrap this episode up, I'm going a little long, is I also originally had this idea of maybe some ancient enemy of Earth, because there was a time, like one of the little teasers were given about the previous 8 civilizations, that there was at least one time where the Earth was kind of a hub of a civilization that either spanned the entire galaxy or spanned multiple galaxies. And it seems likely that such a civilization would have enemies, unless they just conquered everything, which doesn't seem very plausible. And so what if one of these enemies from way, way back millions of years ago, when Earth was a mover and shaker in the galaxy at large, maybe one of these enemies are coming to Earth to get some payback. And maybe throughout, there's all this nanotech just spread throughout the entire solar system that was originally seeded to protect the solar system from these enemies. But in the millions of years, without anybody to maintain this at all, they've gone rogue, or they've gone dormant, or they've shut themselves off to save power or whatever. And maybe, say, the Obsidian Monolith is at least partially, one of its functions is it's like the control center for this solar system nanofield, and the characters have to use it to reactivate this thing before this alien armada gets here and lays waste to Earth. So that was one of the ideas I had in my first list of ideas for the campaign. I have since scrapped that for a couple reasons. The first reason is it's just like ridiculously cliche, right? I mean, you could probably think of 50 movies that have basically that plot or something very similar to it. And the other reason is, if you go back, I don't remember which episode, but if you go back a bit in the GM Intrusions archives, I did an interview with Monty Cook on the show. And one thing that he said in that interview, and I'm not quoting him here, I'm paraphrasing, he said that what he finds interesting in Numenera isn't these big, we have to save the world stories, which are so ridiculously tropic and cliche in fantasy and science fiction, but he finds these smaller stories much more interesting. And hearing him say that and hearing his reasoning in that interview, I completely agree with him. And I actually, every time I see a trailer for a movie or a TV show and they're like, oh, there's a chosen one that's gonna save humanity, or oh, there's this ancient enemy and only this small group of people can defeat them, I just roll my eyes. And that right there is pretty much enough to make me not even want to see the movie almost, because it's like, seriously, you're doing this again? There's a relatively new television show on called Dominion that my wife and I just watched the first episode of the other day. And as soon as they started talking about, oh, there's this baby that's the chosen one that's going to defeat the evil angels, I was like, I am so done with this show. This is so stupid. It's been overdone and overdone. So I don't want to do that with my story. And I also agree with Monty that the smaller stories are more interesting, and it's much more plausible for the players to be very important players in this story, in this drama that has a smaller scope and is more related with a smaller group of people, instead of them saving the world every session, which is just kind of stupid. It's been overdone way too much. And so I kind of scrapped that idea. It's something still in the back of my head that I may come back to and use in the future if I can think of a better, more original angle to take with it. But yeah, so that is an idea that did not make the cut, that I was initially excited about, but then I just realized that it's been done many times before. And that's kind of a rule in writing that will serve you very well as you're coming up with adventures, is usually your first one or two or even three ideas you come up with are going to be cliches. They're going to be things that you've seen in 100 movies or read in 100 books. And so you want to keep digging. You want to just throw out those first few ideas, because they're not going to be original. They're just going to be something you saw someone else do. And you want to really come up with something original.
Coming up next on the Obsidian Monolith.
Okay, so I think that I've covered that pretty well. Just my initial answers to some of the questions that I gave you last episode, and my thoughts and ideas that are seeding this campaign and are the starting point I'm going off from. Next episode, I'm going to start talking about location, and this was a lot of fun. I think and I say fun in quotes, I think I spent far more time trying to decide where to set the beginning of the story than I spent with everything I've talked about in the first two episodes. But I will get into that next week, all my issues with location. Well, that's going to wrap up Game Master's Journey. If you would like to reach me, you can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. please go find me on Google+. You can just search for Lex Starwalker, and please join the Game Master's Journey Google+ community. You can find a link to it on our website at starwalkerstudios.com in the Game Master's Journey show notes. And please follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker. Please call the voicemail 626-LEX-GMI1. And again, please visit our website, starwalkerstudios.com. There you can find the show notes for this show. You can find helpful links to our Google+ community, and you can also find our other podcasts that we put out. So once again, I thank you for joining me on my journey as a game master, and I look forward to coming back next week. So until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Transboy, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.